Hi, welcome to Psyphilopod. My name is Cory Clark, and I'm an assistant professor of social psychology at Durham University in the UK, even though I have this horrible accent that is not fancy and British.
It is rather disappointing.
It's very disappointing. And I also recently learned that I have a terrible vocal fry, as you do as well.
I have also been accused of that. I am Bo Winegard, broadcasting from an undisclosed location in Marietta, Ohio, because I am an assistant professor at Marietta College.
Cool. I don't think we have a title for our episode today, but we're going to be talking about science skepticism generally. And I think, to be fair, we want to start by talking about trust in science, why we should generally trust science, and why science is, as like, what would you call it, an institution or a method or something, is probably the best,
Both.
one of the greatest things we've got going for us. But
yes.
Then also I think we want to talk a little bit about skepticism in science. Is it ever warranted? And then we'll talk a little bit about liberal bias in science, and particularly psychology or social psychology, because that's what we know. And is it something to be worried about? If so, how? And then woven into that conversation, maybe how can regular people know when they should trust science, when they should be skeptical? What should they look for? Something like that. Sound good?
That sounds good to me.
Cool.
So why don't you start us off by telling us why the method and institution of science, why they are awesome.
Why they are awesome. Maybe you should do that, because I think you'll be more enthusiastic because you love institutions.
Well, so I would say the one thing that's important to remember or to keep in mind is that science is not natural. So there are lots of cognitive tendencies.
What do you mean by not natural?
I'm going to get there.
Okay.
So there are lots of tendencies that are natural, cognitive tendencies, certain biases, maybe even religious cognition or certain forms of belief in magic.
Mm-hmm.
Science is not natural. And what I mean by that is it would not develop in a normal individual automatically. So I like to think about this. If you could drop people off on an island and feed them and keep them alive, and let's say you put 10
birth
people,
and they didn't know about.
Yeah, exactly. So people from birth, you keep them alive, you put 10 people on an island, they would come up with supernatural notions of magic, probably. They would not come up with the scientific method because it is counterintuitive. So it's important. Do you disagree with that?
No, I don't disagree. It's just something that I've thought a lot about that seems so obvious to come up with an idea to have like an experiment and have like a treatment condition and a control condition. But I have no idea if I would have come up with that idea on, I guess I probably would not have come up with that idea all on my own, even though it's so basic.
No, that's
because when was that invented? When did we come up with the idea of like a treatment and a control?
I mean, it wasn't really until the 1800s that
it's really pathetic.
The idea got popular. So, I mean, so the important thing here is that science is a powerful institution / method because it's designed to discover the truth. I mean, that's the whole, it was through trial and error to figure out what's the best way of getting at reality. Right. And it turns out that this package of institutional structures and procedures is the best way we know how to arrive at truth and to eliminate bad ideas and promote good ideas. Right. Also, the institution of science, I think importantly, incentivizes people to pursue the truth, at least in most cases, although as we'll talk, there are deviations from this. But that is to say, it's not that scientists are dispassionate and noble, searchers for for the truth no matter what. It's that they're motivated by status, but the way that you get status in science, for the most part, is by coming up with a theory that explains reality better than the next theory.
Right. So science has made a reputation of wanting to pursue the truth, and scientists all want to believe that they are trying to pursue the truth. And as a result, that's people are, if you're a scientist, you forward a bad theory, people are going to disprove you and call you out, prove you're wrong. And over time should maybe make a lot of mistakes, but eventually get somewhere closer to the truth.
Yeah, and not only
and we
that,
don't know of
also,
any other method for doing that, really.
Well, it's certainly not happening. It's not happening in the gender studies department. So postmodern philosophy is not a good way of achieving the truth. Divination might work, but I'm still skeptical about that one.
Yeah, so in general, it's very, very important to trust the scientific method and even to trust science generally. And
well, okay, but wait, I wouldn't say trust the scientific method. I would say the scientific method, the results work, right? It's, it's like what works.
Yeah, particularly for like medical issues.
Well, particularly for anything. If you want to build a bridge that will get you across, Lake Michigan without dying.
Yeah.
Etc.
Yeah. The reason that I think we need to make this point is because science has accomplished so much and is one of the most important things that humankind has, probably the most important thing that humankind has come up with. And you should trust a lot of science. Like you get people, the anti-vax movement is a case of hyper skepticism about science gone very, very, very wrong. And people have died because of it. So, which maybe is you should point out, how could you identify that the anti-vax, that you should trust science about vaccines, is look at consensus. Virtually all scientists agree that vaccines don't cause autism, and you should probably vaccinate your kids.
Well, so before getting into, that seems like a difficult topic. Like, what cues do you use to know what to trust is really difficult. So I want to note that people today take for granted the remarkable achievements of applying critical philosophy and scientific method to our understanding of the world. So if you were to travel back to the 15th century and talk to the people, even the very educated people, the absurdities that they believed in would shock you, right? They just took it for granted that, there were unicorns, angels everywhere, miracles everywhere. Every event was some sort of omen from God, witches. The metaphysical clutter was truly alarming. And mostly what we've
people searching for explanations, right? For things that can't be explained for the most part.
Well, that's interesting. There's some people debate that. So people such as Pascal Boyer would argue that it's not really so much that it's not so much that it's about explaining things that you can't explain. It's just there are certain cognitive byproducts that lead to positing supernatural entities. I'm not sure if I agree with that, because one thing that I've thought about is it certainly seems as though scientific explanations crowd out the supernatural. That is to say, once you explain...
Go ahead.
Are you sure you're not going to interrupt this time?
Go ahead.
Okay. So that is to say, once you explain something, quote unquote, scientifically, it seems as though the supernatural is superfluous, right? So you no longer need the supernatural.
You would think, but obviously a lot of supernatural beliefs persist even among people who have all kinds of other scientific explanations for things.
Sure, I agree with that, but notice that the supernatural beliefs seem to, there used to be the idea of the God of the gaps, right? So you would keep pushing God into like the gap that you can't explain, because it does seem as though that, you know, you explain something, you're like, okay, well, we don't need God to explain this anymore. We don't need God to explain a thunderstorm. We don't need God to explain even actually the rise of humans with evolution, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, I guess that's sort of tangential. The main point is we've certainly...
Babies are proof of God's existence, don't you know?
That's... I concur with that. Or actually, I don't. That's proof of demonic existence, for sure. Dogs are proof of God's existence.
True. That's true.
So it's certainly the case that we've eliminated a lot of preposterous beliefs, and we have explained otherwise inexplicable phenomena. I mean, people need to think, like, imagine that, you know, somebody gets sick in the 13th century. You have no idea, really. I mean, you have very vague ideas of what's actually happening. And of course, your vague ideas are coupled with metaphysical ideas about God's punishment, etc. So just the world that we live in is infinitely better than that world. And a lot of that is exactly as you said, because of science. So it makes sense that science would get a certain prestige, reputation, and, you know, people would start using it as almost like an adjective to mean good. Like, people will say, is that a scientific fact? As if there are facts, and then there are scientific facts. I'm sure I even say this too.
There are non-scientific facts, I suppose, like historical
Such
facts.
as?
A historical fact isn't a scientific fact, I don't think.
I think I mean, it's sort of like the phrase empirical evidence. What other kind of evidence is there? Is there metaphysical evidence?
Yeah.
At any rate, that's also an aside that we don't need to solve, but something I notice in the language, I probably use it myself. So, yes, we live in a much better world, and science is pretty, as the website says, science is pretty effing awesome.
Yeah, so I want to make sure we're not ripping on science in general, and we think, for the most part, you can trust in science. But science has been wrong many, many, many times. It's still wrong about a lot of things. And I guess particularly psychology research and some social psychology research has been having problems. And a lot of things we thought were true, we no longer think are true. And so it's very rational to be skeptical of science sometimes. Why are you looking like that?
Well, so I'm contemplating, I mean, so to say science is wrong seems weird to me. So science is always
Our conclusions have been wrong.
Well, some scientists have promoted, I would put it this way, some scientists have promoted conclusions that turned out to be wrong, right?
Yes.
Because one of the first principles...
But I would say it's not even just individual scientists that science has come to conclusions where possibly even the majority of scientists believed something was true and then turned out they were wrong.
Sure, but this is a problem also with with communicating science, because, I mean, the first principle should be all of your conclusions are accepted provisionally, right?
Yes, but
I mean,
that's not how things go. Once you have enough overwhelming evidence for something, people come to kind of accept certain truths, certain things.
Yeah, that's fair. I accept that. So, but the reason we're talking about this, right, is because I think, at least the reason I'm interested in this, is because a pretty common attack, especially from liberals generally aimed at conservatives, is that they're science deniers, right? And this has become a pretty standard line of insult. In fact, I just saw, I think it was Elizabeth Warren a couple of days ago, said, you know, anybody who denies science shouldn't be able to run for politics or whatever it was she said, right? Yeah. And I thought, well, we'll see what science you endorse.
Yeah, so conservatives get critiqued often for basically rejecting science, and liberals are very pro-science, and therefore liberals are more right about things. But two things to that. One, it makes a lot of sense to be skeptical of science for a lot of things, but also it really makes sense for conservatives to be skeptical of science. And I like to run this thought experiment for people who are super liberal, especially like academic friends. I think we've discussed this before. What if your kid were going to college and you knew all of their, if you're a liberal academic, you knew all of their professors were going to be conservative. Every influential, intelligent person that they were going to talk to for the next 4 years, who's going to be teaching them the skills they need for their future, all of them were conservative. What would you do? You might not want your kid to go to college at all. You certainly would be skeptical of everything they're teaching your kid. And so from that perspective, it's extremely understandable that conservatives would be skeptical of science, skeptical of academics, and even now I think there are recent data showing that conservatives are not wanting their kids to go to university as much as they used to, which also makes complete sense to me. So they kind of get bashed for being anti-science, but at least in certain domains, it makes sense that they would be skeptical and that they would maybe even start to be opposed to higher education, which is probably unfortunate.
Yeah, so right. I think that's a good thought experiment. I guess I would say, just as it pertains to science specifically, imagine that 96% of climate scientists were conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think liberals might have a concern about the veracity of the results? Right? Especially, so I think global warming. Now, I'm not even going to comment on the science because I am in no way qualified to speak about it. Global warming seems to be one of the issues which causes a lot of consternation and I don't know what you would call it, almost self-righteous virtue signaling on the left as they denigrate, Neanderthal Republicans. But there are a couple things going on there. One, most climate scientists are liberal, so obviously that rings the alarm bells.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing is the people who most forcefully promote climate, quote unquote, climate science are generally attracted to big government programs and solutions that are disconcerting to conservatives. So just take the New Deal as sort of the culmination of this, the Green New Deal, excuse me. So this is this package that came out. I think Ocasio-Cortez was like the lead author and champion of this, and it says climate change, anthropogenic climate change, is an existential threat to the world, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And about halfway through it, it turns into a woke doctrine. I mean, it's utterly laughable. It goes from we need to combat this to we need to guarantee everybody a job. All of these sort of progressive ideals, and there's nothing wrong with promoting your policies, but that has nothing to do. I mean, they try to make tenuous connections, but really nothing to do with actually addressing the problem. And I think that causes more skepticism. Conservatives read that and they think, yeah, this is what's going on. They're trying to use this as a Trojan horse to get through all of the policies that they want.
Yeah, one conversation that I've had, again, I mean, I'm also not an expert on climate change at all. I've read some papers on it just because I was kind of curious of the range of opinions that you're getting from scientists, because while there is consensus on the fact that climate change is probably happening, how big of a problem it's going to be, there is not consensus on. The estimates range quite a bit. And what's interesting is there is a failure, I think, of some liberals to appreciate the incentives for climate scientists, to make extreme claims. So there's something called Climategate, where they found that, I don't know enough about this, maybe I shouldn't comment on it, but you should read about it.
I read about it. The thing is, it's a really complicated story, and
yeah.
Both sides obviously tried to make it sound. One side made it sound worse. One side made it sound more innocuous. So it's hard to sort out.
The issue is, all scientists, I think, are probably motivated to publish papers that are going to get a lot of attention. And
Yes.
one way to do that is by making the most extreme claims in any direction you possibly can. So
Yes.
you would get a lot of attention as a climate scientist if you were able to forward evidence that said that it was going to be like the biggest catastrophe ever and everyone was going to die in 50 years. Or if you forward data suggesting it's not a problem at all. And with this,
See, I strongly disagree with that.
you think because people who are
No.
who would be publishing this work are...
Yeah, because I generally I would agree with your principle of extreme claims, right? If you want to become famous, make a bold extreme claim. I think the thing here, though, is it's the extreme claim coupled with the sense of social mission that makes people who are skeptical, such as Curry and other people who have talked about it. I mean, Curry left the field because she just said it was like essentially an ideological cocoon. Because if you say, like, look, I'm skeptical of these extreme estimates, I don't think that it's going to be this bad, people get furious with you. So I think here what you have is a problem where it's only one direction.
That's possibly true. I don't know enough about it, but I suspect if you're one of the few in the field who is arguing against the masses, you're going to get at least a small posse of followers and people who like you.
Oh, well, sure, but that's true everywhere, right?
I mean, and also, I suppose you can think that you're on a sort of moral mission as well, because you can believe that you're like the one person who's really trying to find the truth among all these other ideologically motivated people.
Well, sure, everybody does that. I guess what I would say to that, though, is that, yeah, everybody can, anybody can make preposterous claims and get a small coterie of followers. The important thing is, can you get your work published, and will the mainstream media present it fairly to the public, right?
Yeah, that probably poses a greater challenge for people who tend to minimize estimates about climate change. But again, we should say that neither of us are experts on this.
Yeah, I'm 100% agnostic. I have absolutely no attitude toward the issue at all.
I'm pretty sure that it's happening. We just don't know how big of a problem it
is.
No.
Okay. No. We know it's happening. The question is, how much is it caused by humans?
Will it be?
And how big of a problem will it be?
Yeah.
I care about the skeptic. So one thing I was thinking of when we were talking about this is it's useful to remember all of the disasters that were predicted from the 60s until today, right? Resources were going to be so expensive because we were depleting them, overpopulation, acid rain, there's a hole in the ozone, right? Like, people just catastrophize. That's what humans do. I do it, certainly. Catastrophizing comes pretty naturally to us, and I think people get more and more skeptical when more and more of these predicted catastrophes never come to pass.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the people who thought, from the beginning of Christianity, people thought Jesus was going to come back and strike righteous vengeance and, lift the the moral believers. And, it hasn't happened yet.
I wonder if people are picking up on a little bit of hypocrisy as well. Because if you really are one of these extremists, like climate change is such a serious threat, it's going to be killing people within 50 years. People's behaviors don't really map onto that. People are still driving their... I'm assuming people who are the biggest... I don't know what you would call them, pro-climate change. Well, maybe we could call them that. That seems like maybe an unfair term. I'm not sure. But they're still driving their cars. Some people say that reducing your meat consumption and animal consumption could do something. If that's true, presumably a lot of these
so
people still aren't taking those measures. And even governments who care a lot about this, they're not suggesting citizens stop all carbon emissions, where if it was really such a big threat that we are all going to be dead in 50 years, I think everyone would be taking more drastic measures, particularly the people who believe in this, and yet they're not.
Well, so I have a few things to say about that. First, I don't think anybody's saying everybody's going to be dead in 50 years.
I've had some conversations with some people who've said some similar things.
I would call those people alarmists, so maybe there are a few alarmists who believe that. Second, just if people who care about the facts here is like, even if America cut all of its carbon emissions, we'd still have serious problems, because it's the growth of China that's really the main problem right now.
Blame China, huh?
Yeah, and then further,
I've tried to read a little bit about that, and
well, it is, they do emit more. That's just a fact.
Theirs
I think
is
the
growing.
US is like, yes, I think the U.S. is like 14% of emissions right now.
I think it's more the projections about how big of a problem China is going to be that is alarming to people. But again, I don't know.
Yeah, that might be. At any rate, it does remind me of the concept of cred, or credibility enhancing displays. Are you familiar with that from the psychology of religion? Okay, so the idea is like, you can persuade people better when you emit these creds. So if you're trying to spread a religion, if you behave as though you are strongly committed to it, right? You handle snakes, or you walk around the way Mormons do, house to house, and you're really dedicated to it, people are more persuaded by that. And so I think the same would hold for these people on global warming, right? So if these people were like, I'm trading my car in for a bicycle, I'm not going to use heat, et cetera, that would be a credibility enhancing display. So I think you are right. People do pick up on that. And when DiCaprio or somebody talks about the climate and then flies a private plane, people are like, okay.
Yeah.
Is it actually
maybe
that
you don't even believe what you're saying. Yeah.
Right, but setting aside those people, back, I guess, to the point on the science is, it's the problem. The hard thing about this is, it is reasonable for people to be skeptical, and the calling people deniers, I mean, it's odd because it's only used one way. I mean, how many people are called IQ deniers by the mainstream media, right? Even though, if we're using that framework, there are lots of IQ deniers who, among, I'm sure Elizabeth Warren is probably an IQ denier.
I don't know if that's true, but
I would be surprised if it weren't true. So, yeah, so the problem is, this like kind of seems to be one-sided argument, that it's conservatives who are more skeptical of science. And you can tell us about the literature on this, but one thing I would say, even about the literature that covers skepticism about science, and who is really more skeptical, etc. People have various articles on this. It doesn't cover really the topics that liberals are skeptical of. It doesn't go over. So I'm even skeptical of that literature.
Yeah, but I believe even if you would ask them questions such as, like, we should trust science above religion, liberals are going to obviously score higher on an item like that. So when you have these really generic questions, you're going to get, liberals are going to be more supportive.
But that question is pointless. I mean, it's completely useless. Like, liberals, yes, they're going to say that. What I'm interested in is, when the proverbial rubber meets the road, do they actually behave that way?
Yeah, and I think we could pretty much guarantee that what you'll find is that liberals and conservatives are going to be skeptical about different topics. I don't know who's going to be more skeptical across the board. And I don't know if you could control for example, the ideology of scientists themselves, whether conservatives would still be more skeptical of science or not. If scientists, which you can never create this condition because it's just, you can't manipulate the entire scientific community, But if scientists were more moderate or more representative of all ideological positions, or at least more, we might find that conservatives and liberals are equally skeptical, and it's really just, it's not even a bias against science, it's a bias against liberal science, liberal scientists.
Okay, but yes, and I think you're being charitable. I'm going to be a
To
little
whom?
uncharitable to liberals. I'm going to be a little bit uncharitable, although I think this is actually accurate. I think the amount of almost metaphysical twaddle that liberals believe in suggests that they're pretty biased, and I don't know if the bias is equal. It's hard to know. It's domain specific, as you said, but the skepticism. I mean, so what? This is what bothers me on the liberal side. You get these people, writers for Vox, let's say, they're intelligent people, so they will say, "Oh, of course we don't believe, or of course we believe in genetically caused sex differences. It's outrageous to say that we don't." But then, anytime anybody says, "Here are some sex differences," they get outraged. Right? So they're always like, they have these vague, of course we believe this, but then if anybody makes the assertion, they become angry with it. And furthermore, on top of that, they promote absolutely ludicrous ideas. And I'll just give you one example, himpathy. Himpathy is this example, this concept forwarded by Kate Mann, who may be a perfectly wonderful person, but the concept is just wrong. And so the idea is, people have this almost pathological sympathy for powerful men who, well, for men in general, I suppose, but especially for powerful men who commit crimes, and that this is like, I guess they don't have this for women, or I don't know what.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just a transparently ludicrous concept, and people have torn it to shreds.
It is the opposite of true. If you look at like actual juror decision making, if anything, women are treated more leniently than men.
Right, and I mean, they're seen as if you're going to make a movie and you want a victim, you use a woman, because people sympathize with women more. And the one piece of evidence man keeps forwarding, so far as I can tell, that's not just absolute anecdote, and actually risible anecdote at that, is a few studies that seem to suggest that people were a little bit more skeptical of girls' expressions of pain than boys. Is that right?
Yeah, there have been, I believe, at least a few of these studies. One published recently by
I think
colleague
Earp
of mine,
was on
Brian
that.
Earp, or Earp. I don't know how you pronounce it. Maybe Earp. I
Yeah,
should know because he's on a paper with me. But yeah, so his. But then there have been others as well. And this makes a lot of sense, I think, that people just think women probably exaggerate their pain. They think maybe they're kind of like sissies, so when they complain about stuff, people don't take it as seriously.
Well, no, I actually think this is important, because I think your hypothesis here, your explanation, I haven't seen a lot of people make it, including I haven't seen Earp say it when he's
Somebody should test it, so let's tell them what it is.
So let's forward this hypothesis, which seems utterly obvious once you hear it. So your argument is, people, it's not that people don't sympathize more with girls, right? They actually would. It's that they think girls are more likely to emit signs of pain when they're not actually experiencing anything that would cause them damage, right? And that's probably rational, right?
Yeah, so the idea is that people view women as kind of like weak and fragile, and that makes them care more about women's well-being than men's in general, and there are mountains of data to support that finding. People care
whoa. Yeah. So, I'm sorry, I do need to interrupt, because I don't think that's why people care more about women's well-being.
Okay, so why do you think people care more about women's well-being?
I think ultimately it has to do with their reproductive value.
Well, ultimately.
They're just more crucial to a coalition. Men are more disposable on average.
Yeah, but again, we're talking ultimate and proximate causes here. I suspect that people actually do view women as more in need of protection. And yes, ultimately women are more valuable because you don't need as many men as you do women. So women's lives in some sense are more valuable than men's
Yeah.
lives. That doesn't mean we should treat them that way, but the point is,
no, it just means evolutionarily
right,
their egg is more valuable.
Yeah, we should value them more.
Yeah.
Anyway, so people care more about the well-being of women, but they perceive them as kind of fragile and vulnerable and weak, and women actually are weaker than men physically. And so we kind of think that when they experience pain, it's possible they're sort of exaggerating and they're not really like suffering that much. And I think a good comparison is to think about, and I don't mean this to be anything negative about women at all, but it's similar to people's attitudes toward children. We care way more about children than we do about adults and their well-being and their survival. But we also think they have a tendency to sort of exaggerate their pain, and maybe make a bigger deal of situations than they should. And this, I think, this is a testable hypothesis, I think, is that in cases of ambiguous harm, where you don't know for sure that a woman or a man or a child or an adult is suffering, they might not care that much more about the child or the woman. But in a case of obvious harm, they will absolutely care more about the woman or the child.
Well, yes, but I think the ambiguous, the way of stating that as ambiguous harm is a little misleading. What you mean is when an adult versus, let's say, a kid is crying.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not that the harm's ambiguous, because I think error management, you would still err on the side of trying to protect the kid. It's probably, that if an adult is crying, unless it's a woman, because women cry more, that's just true. It's also more socially acceptable. No, I'm sure that plays into it a bit. But so if a 30, not a career in acting right there. If a 30-year-old man is crying, you can be reasonably confident that something really bad is going on, right?
Yeah, if you see like a big dude crying, you're going to be pretty sure he's suffering. Whereas if a 4-year-old's crying, you're gonna want to make sure that they're okay. But if they look fine, you're gonna think it's probably something silly.
Right. So I guess the point that spurred this is that you have these relatively mainstream left-wing liberal/liberal. I mean, Vox, it's gone from neoliberal, kind of quasi-neoliberal, to more progressive, but still, like, these are pretty mainstream left-wing websites, and they're just ludicrous about science. Right now, once in a while, I will say, I should say this, Vox has an excellent article once in a while about, say, IQ or something. And there are other things on the website that are decent. I don't mean just to disparage it, but I can understand. So, like, if you're a conservative and you see this, it's eminently rational to be skeptical of what's going on, right?
Yes. Yes. And I still... I don't know how much skepticism of science is justified and how much isn't. But I do think it's unfair to draw the conclusion that because conservatives seem more skeptical of science, at least in certain domains, and maybe even in science in general, given the ideological composition of scientists, I don't think it's really fair to conclude that therefore they're somehow like cognitively inferior, or that they have a looser grip on reality than liberals.
Well, I would also I would add that I'm not sure that they're more in denial about current science, especially, let's say, like research on sex differences, group differences, etc. I would say that the big deniers, the ostriches with their heads in the sand, are predominantly liberals. Now, that doesn't mean all liberals or even most liberals, but it does mean that liberal outlets routinely deny very, I would consider, elementary results and theories in these fields. Psychometrics, for example, almost the entire discipline as it relates to IQ is either misunderstood or basically denied in one way or another by lots of mainstream liberals.
Yeah.
So we don't know until somebody actually tests with the full panoply of scientific issues, right? Because the problem is, you generally speaking, right, you get a liberal to do science denial, and even a good intentioned liberal has some of these biases, so they don't even think to ask about, say, group differences, which we've asked about, or sex differences perhaps, or certain genetic research, etc.,
or even
issues
take an easy one is like a lot of research on parenting and how parenting affects children later on. People almost don't even, a lot of the time you see this research and people don't even consider the possibility that it's that parents and their children share similar genes. They just assume parenting styles are causal without even...
Well, absolutely. Although there, I would say probably conservatives are equally, if not
that may be one where
more
everyone's
guilty.
Pretty off.
Yeah, it's this very bizarre thing. Everybody, I mean, for one thing, although I do think conservatives are generally more open to genetic explanations when it comes to human nature,
I suspect it varies based on, and in fact, it definitely does.
So, like, if it's homosexuality or obesity, let's say, then liberals prefer it.
Yes, liberals prefer genetic explanations for homosexuality and obesity.
Right.
Conservatives,
Right, but still, I mean, I guess the point is conservatives still like the idea that parenting really matters.
Yeah.
And so they like to explain things as, well, this is being caused by the breakdown of the American family or whatever. And, maybe there's something there. But I think both, it's sort of like blaming public education. It's something almost everybody can agree sucks, even though I'm not sure that it does.
Yeah.
So the I guess one thing that's important to me, and one reason I care a lot about, as people who follow me know, about liberal bias in academia, it's not because I hate liberals. In fact, I'm very sympathetic to a lot of the liberal goals, but rather because
I am a liberal,
I believe,
I think,
of all things to be, it's rather because I think that this is going to start undermining higher education and science. It's going to, people are going to become, and they should become, skeptical of a lot of social science.
Yeah. And the more crap we pump out, the less people will take us seriously. So there are real costs to, I don't know.
Yeah, there are enormous costs, right? Because when you pump out, I mean, you and I probably stumble across an article at least once a week that causes my brain to melt down because it is so...
We don't have to call any particular paper out.
I totally disagree with that. If you publish a paper, then you should be criticized in the public domain. That's exactly how science is supposed to work. Yeah, but I think
you want to forward new data and not just be like, that idea is stupid.
Well, first of all, I only say that idea is stupid in private. In public, I would always try to be constructive. But no, I completely disagree with that. That's not how science... That sounds like the Cortez argument. Well, if you can't criticize me unless you have an idea. No, that's not how things work.
That's not what I'm saying.
Well, I don't need data to criticize a purported explanation, right? If I tell you that I went into my office 20 days last week and my computer was just levitating in the center of the office, and you criticize that, I wouldn't say, well, collect data on it. Can't criticize me until you collect the data. Anyway,
well, you don't have to collect new data. You have to draw
Okay.
on existing data.
I am going to refrain from commenting on the article that you know that I'm thinking of, but let me just put it this way. There are absolutely atrocious articles that get published every week in very, very prominent journals in the social sciences.
Mm-hmm. That the
Articles
only potential
about 2
explanation for
minutes.
why they get published is that every reviewer and the editor had to be extremely ideologically motivated. There's no other explanation.
Right. I mean, and now this is important. I do want to address this. So this undermines trust in science, and that's important. We're going to get back to that.
Mm-hmm.
Importantly, I think this is important because results came out, and I think this is good results.
Mm-hmm.
J. Van Bavel or Bavel, maybe? I'm
Bavel,
not sure.
Van Bavel.
Okay, Bavel.
I think.
Van Bavel and a few other researchers, I believe, were on this project.
Yeah, Diego Reinero, I believe, is the lead author.
Was Crawford on it?
Jarrett Crawford's on there. I think there may be like 5 or 6 authors.
Okay, so what they found was that
well, let's explain what they did first. So they took some studies from social psychology that had attempts to replicate them had already been made. So they had information about whether these studies replicate or not. And then they had basically 2 studies, one where they had PhD students. I think only 6, but maybe that doesn't really matter. But they wanted conservative, moderate, and liberal PhD students to rate them for how, let's say, liberal friendly or conservative friendly or moderate friendly or politically irrelevant. Or maybe that was for the anyway, they had them rate them for how liberal or conservative friendly they are, and then compared their ratings of how friendly they are to liberal or conservatives to how replicable they are. So
yes.
The idea being that if liberal bias in social psychology is a problem and it's causing us to pump out bad research that cannot replicate, what you should find is that liberal research that has liberal conclusions, should be less replicable than research with conservative conclusions. And I think that's a very reasonable hypothesis to make. But I think they were testing competing hypotheses. So either that would happen or there wouldn't be a difference. And that liberal bias actually isn't a problem. Or not that it's not a problem, it's not affecting our science in some particular way, or the quality of our science in some particular way.
Right. So some people framed it as it's not that much of a problem, and this is why I wanted to address this, because they did find, right, that liberal, quote-unquote liberal results were equally replicable.
Mm-hmm.
And so that there wasn't this difference. Now, one thing one problem is, and this is a problem with us, we haven't tracked down these so-called conservative results.
I have.
Oh, you did? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
So what's an example?
Well, so my first thought on this, which I think I'm now wrong about, my first thought was that people wouldn't be good at identifying like a liberal-friendly result, because I didn't think, for example, a result that shows that people are like really sexist or racist would be considered a liberal finding. And I think they probably would have been. So I was given a sample of 3 liberal and 3 conservative findings. So of the 3 liberal ones, it was, and these are me just kind of summarizing in a sentence what the abstract said, that low minority representation cues as opposed to cues of valuing diversity led African American participants to feel more threat and to distrust the institution.
Okay, so I think we're all more concerned with the conservative findings.
Oh, we are right? All more concerned. No, because I think these are good. I think you want to have a representative sample. So then there are only 3 for each, so you can wait. It'll only take a minute.
Okay, that's fair.
Second one was system threat leads men to have greater romantic interest in women who embody benevolent sexist ideals. And that the third one is that stereotype threat leads whites to distance themselves from blacks. Okay, so those are like extreme liberal ones. Okay. The extreme conservative ones, supposedly, and I will say that, well, maybe I'll say it in a second. So the 3 conservative ones were that porn exposure decreases attractiveness ratings of a nude female, and that men who are more attracted to a Playboy centerfold then rated themselves as less in love with their wives.
Okay.
That people believe that, this one I really don't understand. People believe that tempting fate leads to more negative outcomes. So I guess conservatives believe more in fate.
Yeah, so these are like religious conservatives.
And that men are more distressed by sexual infidelity and women are more distressed by emotional infidelity.
How's that conservative?
I don't know.
Okay, so one thing to note about that is that the liberal results are actually obviously liberal, and the conservative ones are not clearly conservative to me.
I would agree that of those three, only the first one to me seems maybe kind of conservative because it's suggesting we shouldn't have like super sexually liberal, whatever rules or norms.
Yeah, but that's like the faucet effect, and actually, like I'm skeptical of what it means, but that's an old effect.
But I will add, and I don't know if he selected the most extreme ones for me or if these are just supposed to be representative ones, but they did find, I think, in one or possibly both studies that more extreme, ideologically extreme research was less likely to replicate. And if you look at the tables, there weren't any extreme conservative ones, really. There were only extreme liberal ones, and there were more liberal ones in general. So I don't exactly know what that means. It's possible that it would be moderated such that it's really these extreme liberal ones don't replicate, but like moderate liberal ones are more or just as replicable as moderate conservative ones.
Right, and then the two things that I would say about that, I'd like to see the other. I can't judge without looking at the other conservative examples, but those ones are very underwhelming. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, and then, I agree. I didn't think that they were not nearly as representative of what you think of a conservative like a good conservative finding maybe would be like, what would be a good conservative finding, like free markets or something?
I've thought something about like giving people like welfare makes them like lazy or not participate in the group, or at any rate, so
like
I'm
research on
by those.
monogamy maybe.
Yeah, I'm underwhelmed by those, but I can't judge because I don't know all of the examples. Two things I would say about that is, one, I would really predict where you would find this effect, where you'd find a large effect, is when it comes to perceived victims groups, because that's the real liberal sacred value. And then two, it's not so much the results, but rather that the way the results are framed, where you see this massive bias, right? So, like, I think a lot of the effects might be real, although small, that liberals often promote, but they generally have much more simple explanations, I think, than the ones that are provided in these papers. And that's the example, of course, in the one paper that we're specifically thinking about, and that got published in Science Advancements, but still Science. Nature? No, it was Science.
Science Advances, maybe. Now people are going to be able to figure out what paper it was.
I don't care. It's okay. I think it's a bad paper.
Yeah, it's not great.
I mean, the authors can debate me, and that's how science should work. I'm happy to have that discussion with them, and they're also welcome. Well, yeah, no, it'd be a nice debate. We can have a friendly, amicable debate, and also I would invite all people. They can look up my ResearchGate and feel free to criticize any paper that I've published, and we'll have a happy debate about it.
There to rip apart.
There are some extremely high impact articles there. So anyway,
that are terrible.
Yeah. So anyway, what was the liberal
ones though? This is why I'm kind of curious if he gave me the most extreme liberal ones, because I'm guessing none of those replicate. I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
I don't know about the system threat and the
not even real
benevolent sexism one. I don't know. I'd have to guess the other two don't replicate, but I'm not sure. I should have asked him.
I mean, it seems to me the best evidence on stereotype threat is that it's not a thing. So what was the point all the way back at the beginning here?
They're not going. You would predict that and I think I would maybe predict this too with these this Raniero Van Bavel data, that they actually might be right pretty much like across the board for many types of liberal and conservative findings, but there might be specific ones, specific domains within social psychology where you would find a bias. And the one that Lee Jossam loves to post on Twitter that I think is useful is it the C.C. and Williams and the other similar papers where
women were more likely to be hired?
Yeah, but I think he contrasts that to other papers who looked at hiring decisions between men and women.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
And
well,
whether,
this is looking at citation rates, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that would indicate some kind of bias that might be a problem. So just that research that shows that people are sexist against women gets cited more than research showing that they're not, or that, in fact, women are favored.
Right.
And you would predict that it's probably harder to publish research that would draw that conclusion.
Yeah, there's even that example, and even Matt Iglesias from Vox was making this same basic argument, although not quite the argument that I would make. But there was I think it ended up in the New York Times. There was an article in the New York Times that said it cited this study that purported to show that when women applied for, I think it was for a STEM job, like 56% of them got a callback. But then when you included, data that sexed them, that made it clear that they were women, only like 5% got a callback. Right?
Yeah, what did Lee call it? Like an unidentified, like something study.
Oh yeah. Yes.
I forget. But it doesn't exist, right?
Is,
apparently.
Yeah, it's not even. So some woman actually was just like, that doesn't. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Like, that's way too big of a gap. You'd never find that. Yeah. And so she tried to track this down, and it doesn't even exist. Now, let's ask this question: could I get in the New York Times with an article that argued that actually women were more likely to get hired? No, not a chance, because the editor would be like, where's the source for that? Yeah. And then, I mean, even if the editor even let it in, right? Like, there are obvious, like, facts that can't even get in, but even if you did get it in, they would vet the source strenuously. So this does show you, and so all of this is to say, right, that the social sciences are, I would go so far as to say, spectacularly liberally biased. Now, I don't think that affects a lot of areas of research, but in social psychology, I think it's pretty alarming. And you and I believe, went through the SPSP, like just the program, and we were looking at how many of these are political and then how many are like pretty clearly social justice political. And it was like almost what were these presentations?
I was reading the names of the talks within individual symposium sessions.
Yeah. Okay, so these were talks. Yeah. And it was,
we only got through the first few pages, but
sure,
within the first few pages, it was like 60% social justice or something.
Yeah, so what I would say is, ask yourself this: if you're a liberal, imagine that the most important social psychology conference, not every, but 70% of the presentations were why welfare makes people lazy, monogamy is the way to go, protecting the nuclear family, and they had all these weird measures like the IAT that predicted like 1% of behavior about how abortions are bad and all of these things. What would your attitude towards social psychology be?
Yes, but the argument that liberals would make is that liberals are just, or that this is what Barron and Jost make in response to our meta-analysis, is just that liberals are just more right about stuff and they're more scientifically inclined. So that's why our conferences look the way they do, because liberals are more interested in communicating the truth about the world with other people.
Well, I will say this. I hereby declare that I am happy to have a debate with Barron and Jost or Jost alone about that. And I would say,
on our podcast.
I would be happy to. And I would say that although that's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis to forward, that is to say, it could be that one ideological mindset is just more right. I think that the overwhelming evidence show that that's poppycock. And I mean that in the nicest way possible. So I'd be happy.
I don't think you can say that. I don't think we know. I don't think you can say one way or the other who is more right about stuff. I mean, conservatives have religion, so it's a pretty big one.
I don't know what you're talking about there. If you don't believe God came into human history, and I don't know what to tell you about that one. Okay, so I agree with you that
again, it probably just doesn't really make sense to make these sweeping conclusions. Well, okay, but conservatives are non-scientific and they're just wrong about.
No, I agree with that. But I guess what I would say is the strong hypothesis. I hear this often. I get this on my Twitter feed sometimes. Liberals are just right, and that's why science is the way it is. That I am happy to dismiss as poppycock, because that is definitely not true, because there are plenty of correct ideas that you can't even talk about in social psychology departments.
You can't quantify like rightness, like the amount of rightness that a group has or is or whatever.
No, I know, but the claim there is like, look, the reason the field looks the way it does is simply because it's right, and liberal, reality is liberal, is what they would say. Now, I can dismiss that. That is definitely not true, because the reason the field ignores lots of results that we know are true, right?
It could
be resolutely ignorant
multiple causes. One could be discrimination against conservatives, making them feel uncomfortable, like their ideas don't matter. One could be that liberals on average are more right about things. Probably abandoning religion helps be right about some stuff. Helps you be right about some stuff.
I object to that.
Anyway,
theology.
There could be a lot of reasons why.
Okay,
one of them could be that liberals are actually more scientifically minded or something.
Okay, but I think you're misunderstanding what I'm saying. I agree with everything you just said, but what I'm saying is the claim that the reason social psychology looks the way it does is because reality is just liberal is demonstrably false, because there are plenty of effects and theories.
They wouldn't say that liberals are right about everything.
No, I know. No. Okay, so please let me make the point carefully.
In fact, they even give the example of how liberals were wrong about the heritability of intelligence in their response.
I'm trying to mansplain right now, and I don't know why you're not letting me. Okay. It's okay, because the viewers will have himpathy for me, so I feel good about that. Okay, so I agree with everything you've said, but my point is, if the claim is the reason social psychology looks the way it does is simply because reality is liberal.
I don't think they say simply.
Hold on,
you're straw manning them. Just saying.
No. I'm saying no. I'm not. Okay, that's fair. I'm not talking about Barron and Jost right now. I'm talking about people who say this. They say reality is just liberal, and because I'm saying yes, you're right, but Barron and Jost's claim, I think, is debatable. I think they're wrong, but I think it's at least debatable. I'm talking about this more extreme claim that the reason social psychology looks the way it does is because reality is liberal. That's a claim that a lot of people make to me. I've heard that claim many times.
I don't know if many people say that.
I
don't know if many people say that's like the only reason, though.
Okay, so all the way back from 2011, when Haidt gave, I'm ignoring what you said, when John Haidt gave his speech about liberal bias in social psychology. A very common retort was, yes, reality is liberal. Deal with it, conservatives, right? Now, what I'm saying is, we can dismiss that. That is definitely false because there are tons of facts that we know that are almost indisputable that we don't talk about in social psychology that are completely verboten. And it's not because reality is liberal that we don't talk about them. It's because liberals don't like these results. So in this case, reality is conservative and liberals just don't talk about it. And in fact, not only do they not talk about it, but they morally bully you if you decide or maybe make the mistake that you want to talk about it. So that's what I'm saying. I agree with you that the more nuanced debate that maybe liberals are right more often, that's an open hypothesis. I agree.
Yeah, I think you wouldn't say it's one thing entirely. It's probably not. It's probably caused by multiple things. Liberals aren't more right on everything, obviously. We also know pretty much for a fact that liberals do discriminate against conservatives. The Inbar and who was the other author? Lammers paper.
Yeah.
Where people were willing to admit some amount of discrimination. To me, it would be quite, let's say, this Raniero paper, if we were able to get sort of a balance of really true conservative findings and really true liberal findings that were like equally extreme in their conservatism or liberalism, and they still found no difference in replicability, what would you say to that?
I would say that that's really important to know, and that I'm glad about that, is what I would say. I'd be shocked if they found it, but if they did, I would say, okay, that it would cause...
I wouldn't be shocked if they found it sort of broadly, but...
But wait, say what now?
If they found it sort of, if you could find a lot of domains of like liberal and conservative findings, and on average they kind of balanced out and really replicable.
Let me tell you, okay, but one reason I'm very skeptical of that is because when you think of the spectacularly wrong zombie theories, right? That is to say, theories that keep getting refuted and don't replicate but stick around.
What do you mean,
they
like
all seem to
stereotype threat and like IAT
Exactly. They all seem to promote a liberal worldview. And I can't think of one that promotes a conservative worldview.
Yeah, well, it's hard to think of any that promote a conservative worldview.
Anyway. And you can, okay, so I give you an example. You can see, so the example in the New York Times, right?
In which there were...
So that's what I get not paid to do. So there was the New York Times we talked about. Let me give you another example of like.
Okay, but just so you know, we're running out of time. So.
Oh, okay. Maybe I don't want to then. That's fine. Well, I'll save that gem for some other time.
All right. Well, do you have any brilliant closing remarks or anything we didn't say that we should have said? Because I wanted to be clear that science is awesome and that in general it should be trusted as an institution and as a method. But there are reasons to be skeptical of particular areas of science and certain findings, and being skeptical doesn't necessarily make people not interested in knowing the truth. In fact, it might be interest in knowing the truth that causes people to be skeptical of some science.
I'll say cheers to that, and then I will add this. I totally and completely agree that science is awesome, and that the scientific method is it's really one of the great achievements of civilization. And I would say that my concern is not about liberals or conservatives, really. It's more about people who, what do I want to say, repudiate the scientific method or scientific results when those results are inconvenient for their worldview that I care about. I don't care what side that happens on. It happens to be the case that, as I've said before, and I'm sure you will agree with this, we swim in a sea of liberalism. And therefore, I am particularly sensitive to liberalism, and I care more about correcting the biases of liberals. If I were in a conservative universe, if I were at some conservative college or something, then I would care more about that. So that's what I care about.
Yeah, maybe we should do another one of these where we like pick on conservatives a little bit. To be fair.
That's absolutely, I would be thrilled to.
Maybe next week or whatever.
I think I would say science is an equal opportunity offender, it seems, for the most part. But it's still awesome, and our world is a lot better today because of it.
Later.